Welcome to the 2021 edition of Ipsos Global Trends. This is where we try and look across the world, asking dozens of questions to understand how society is changing. We used to do this study every 3 years. Now we do it every year because the world is becoming even more exciting. And we're calling this edition Aftershocks and Continuity. And you can read all your hot takes that everything will change. The world has changed forever. Life will never be the same for people over 60, and I'm 56, so I'm watching out for that. Cities will never look the same after the pandemic. Pandemic proofing, insurance may never be the same again. Bali will never be the same again. COVID-19 is a boomer remover. Well, I'm a boomer, so I've just about survived so far. The new normal will be far more tech-driven, presenting more big challenges. The new normal will look like the old normal. We need a born-again world. So how much of this stuff is true? Well, those of you who've been watching the Ipsos Global Trends will know that last year we checked in to see exactly what had happened. Our model of change is that we know about macro forces that affect us all. We'll look at those in a minute. They're big, slow-moving things that affect the entire planet. We then have shifts in our society that we measure in a lot of the research that we do. And then finally, we can see signals all over our communities, our high streets, our main streets, our shopping malls, where we can see things, things happening on the ground. Those things all interplay with each other, of course, and you need to understand change at each level if you're going to be effective in understanding how the future might be. But of course, COVID-19 is this tiny little thing that has absolutely upended everything, and its shocks are sort of echoing through the system. We can see many, many signals. We have, at the moment, of course, taking place very shortly, COP26, the world getting together in Glasgow in the United Kingdom to talk about what we're going to do on carbon reduction. China has already said it's going to end funding for coal power stations. We've had, in the last year, a revelation of just the sort of changes that AI might be able to do, something that no human being could ever do. AlphaFold is a program to understand human proteins that cause the functioning of every cell in our bodies. It has massive implications for the future of biotechnology, for our understanding of biology generally. If you're concerned about living to 1,000, this is absolutely the AI for you. And what we have done in one fell swoop is go from understanding 17% of human proteins which make your body function, to understanding 98% of them. That was only possible with AI. We have, of course, as we come out of the pandemic, endless headlines about shortages of food, shortages of drivers, shortages of places to park chips, shortages of everything, shortages of labour, big issue in my industry. And yet we don't know quite how long those things will be there. The central bankers tell us that the inflation that we're seeing at the moment will be a temporary phenomenon and go away next year. Other people, including me, think it might be around for rather longer. And if it is, with the level of indebtedness that many governments have, that is going to be profoundly disruptive. We can also see, of course, the world cracking down on technology in many cases. President Xi in China is doing it. Last time in this survey, 8 out of 10 people told us globally that big tech needed to be better regulated. President Xi is leading the way. We'll see how that plays out in the West. And then finally, of course, we haven't vaccinated the world. We've vaccinated largely wealthy Western countries, and the aftershocks of COVID itself across the world will continue, and in terms of disease and death, and unfortunately, we can see in Western populations that whole generations will have had their educations permanently disrupted. So these are some signals that we can see around the world. We will keep watching them and seeing what happens. Now, the macro forces don't change. They were there before COVID. They will be there after COVID. The rise of countries and growth of countries in Africa, where Nigeria will have more people in it very soon than either Europe or the whole of America. The growing inequality that is behind much of the upheaval in politics in Latin America, in Britain, in Europe, across the Western world. That loss of the future. Before the pandemic, we saw about half the population in many Western countries expecting their children to end up poorer than them. The figure at the beginning of this century was only about 1 person in 8 thinking that was going to happen. That is a massive psychological shift. The pandemic hasn't changed that. That unhappiness about the future, the loss of the future remains. Geopolitical tensions, they were there before the pandemic. If anything, the pandemic has sharpened them. The massive data exploding exponentially every second and how we master it. Again, it's there, and things like AlphaFold show us what we might be able to do with it. Those technology tipping points that may change our lives in the 2020s, and indeed need to help us solve some of the problems we face, like climate change, because the overwhelming macro force we now face is, of course, the fragility of the planet that we're on. And COVID-19 itself is a zoonotic disease. It's come from animals, from human encroachment on animals, same as MERS, same as SARS, same as HIV. And that is the number one challenge that humanity agrees on being a challenge, even if it doesn't agree on the solution. What we can see is globalisation stumbling, whether it's the ships crashing in the canal in some ways was just a signal of some of the potential disruption that we could see coming down the track as the economies reopened. We can see China's growing power. It's going to be the largest economy in the world, but also tensions with its neighbours and further afield. And of course, the rebound coming out of the pandemic and the massive disruption in supply that we're also seeing at the same time. So, 1.5 years into the pandemic, the Global Trends Survey, of course, is looking at hundreds of issues normally, but in the last 2 years we've done a dip each year just to see what's changing and what hasn't. So where do public values change? Where are they not changing? And of course, just a quick reminder, back in 2019, as we went into the pandemic, we identified 12 key trends, a lot around upheaval, data, health, the need for authenticity in brands. And then, of course, last year in the pandemic that apparently would change everything, we looked to see what did change. And a lot of things actually simply didn't change. The things that I've lit up here were things where we saw change, but very often that change was not a new direction, but just an acceleration of an existing trend. And then in 2021, what have we seen around the world? And here, if we look at the same chart, we can see a lot of continuity. We'll see in a second how concern about climate change has gone on rising. But we can also see some, perhaps some signs that globalization is being reassessed. Perhaps some signs on authenticity where there's even more pressure on brands to stand up and be counted, and some perennials that we saw more concern about the future as a result of the pandemic. That's continuing. So this is the distillation, of course, of hundreds of questions from dozens of countries, but let's just look at where we can see that clear road continuity in the trends. The first thing is that climate change is a key concern, and if anything, concern about climate change has just gone on rising around the world. So the proportion who say we're heading for environmental disaster unless we change our habits quickly has risen virtually everywhere since 2013. So there is willingness and agreement that there is a problem. There is not necessarily agreement on the solution, but certainly the public everywhere are more and more cognizant of climate change. And of course, if you talk to the scientists, the 2020s are the time when we will have to make very big changes if we are to have any chance of avoiding irreversible temperature rises on this planet, and we don't have a spare planet. So will we manage it in the 2020s? Let's hope we do. Other things that we can see, actually when we talk about how business is behaving, concern about climate change now exceeds companies not paying enough tax. So you can pay your taxes in a tax haven somewhere, a nice low-rate country like Ireland or Luxembourg, but you've got to do something about reducing harm to the environment. And you can see that for most people, the environment is now more important than things like actually paying your taxes, just reflecting how important it is. And if we look at this by different generations, we can see quite a strong generational skew, with the young in particular, of course, in this particular instance, saying that it's, Amazon's taxes, for example, less important than its environmental impact. So, this is not going away in the 2020s. Overall, though, I think the pandemic has seen, despite all the disinformation, despite the anti-vaxxers, despite the conspiracy theories, actually rising optimism about the power of science. And indeed, what we were able to do with the vaccine in a few short months that would normally take 5 to 10 years is, of course, evidence of just how amazing the world can be, or human societies can be, when they need to. So across the world, we've seen ongoing rises in the proportion of people who say that eventually all medical conditions and diseases will be curable. We're an optimistic bunch. We've also seen another trend rising, and that is data apathy. The proportion of people who say that we worry too much about privacy, I'm not concerned about what companies or the governments know about me, that has been rising in Britain, in France, in Germany. And in some countries, of course, the government already knows everything about you because it's a sort of technocracy rather than a democracy. But certainly data apathy we identified last year, it's carried on rising this year. Radical transparency, particularly for the rising generations where their entire lives have been lived online. They don't separate their offline and their online lives. It's just all out there. So while there's concern about data privacy and the power of big tech companies, actually, for many people, it's just indispensable to life, and it's inevitable that there'll be a loss of privacy. So where are we seeing some changes? And here I think there are some things where the pandemic does seem to be driving some differences. The first is the rise of brand purpose. So here we're looking back globally to 2013. You can see there Britain, America and France have chosen those data points, and you can see overall this clear upward trend, the highest proportion we've seen in this time series so far. I want to buy brands that reflect my personal values. Of course, what people say and what they do aren't always the same, but certainly it does no harm for a brand to reflect the values of the people it's selling to. And when we look at the role business plays in society generally, you can see a large part of the world, particularly developing countries, where people absolutely want business to speak out, often because government is seen as weak. But you can see that in many, many markets. It's a bit less in Europe and America, and America, of course, quite polarized in many ways. But in many, many countries, you can see people expecting business to stand up and be counted. And that's something I think that all CEOs, including people like me, have got to reflect on. When do you say something about the issues facing the country? The customers, the public expect you to. And yet, when we come down to, of course, that purchasing decision, what actually happens there? I don't care if a brand is ethically or socially responsible. I just want them to make good products. And this, of course, is that gap between what people say and what they do. And you can see that about 4 in 10 people in most markets typically, actually, ultimately are going to buy with the best value product, not necessarily the most ethical or socially responsible one. Overall, then, we've shifted a lot of retail online during the pandemic, but interestingly, the proportion who are saying they're finding it more difficult than offline is actually rising in many markets. And this seems strange. Online retailing is a mastery of amazing choice, simple one-click purchasing. Why on earth would it be more difficult than shopping in traditional stores? And I think it's partly simply too much choice. Too much complexity. We're so good now at bombarding people with messages, targeted messages, that actually in some ways consumers seem to be bewildered by choice. And it's interesting when you look at who is experiencing most of the friction. Actually, it's not people my age. It's people my son's age, in his 20s. Gen Z, 47% of Gen Z saying they find shopping online more difficult than shopping in traditional stores. And of course, many of those people are almost digital natives. They are spending huge amounts of time online. And actually, maybe there is a future somewhere for physical retail and all this, a nicely curated selection. I really don't want to go to a huge, huge store with 500 different types of jeans. I just want to look at 3 or 4 types of jeans and choose the one that's probably going to be right for me. Certainly that shift of retail online, which happened during the pandemic, it's not going to go back, and the proportion of our markets that is still ripe for digitization is enormous in many countries. But certainly it was interesting to see in this that actually physical retail still has a lot of attractions, and there's only about 1 person in 5 who wants to do all their shopping online. The other thing that we've seen changing the narrative during the pandemic, of course, particularly big in America, but also in the UK and many other countries, was the Black Lives Matter protests. People at lockdown and finally having enough of how ethnic minorities were treated. So we asked people, do you think the racism and other sorts of intolerance in the US is present where you live? 8 out of 10 people in Britain, 75% in France, 7 out of 10 people in Germany. The majority of people in Japan, 7 out of 10 people in Italy, all say yes, it's an issue. And I think that sort of lockdown experience where we focused on just that one murder by the police of George Floyd has really changed the narrative for many younger people. And we've got to remember that in many of our societies, the younger generations are very different than the ones currently, than the adult population. In my own country, Britain, some of you will know from TV, film and others, some of you have been here. But when I ask you to guess what proportion of people at school in England today are not white British, most people guess perhaps 15 or 20% in our perils of perception work. The actual number is 32.5% of people at school in England are not white British. Our countries, many of our countries are changing through migration. It's also changing the way we think about minorities and difference. And if you're a brand, you need to be ready, of course, to deal with a much more diverse clientele in many traditional markets. At the same time, I think we should perhaps reassure ourselves that all across the world, most people agree that actually where they live, everybody gets on well. So you can see Indonesia, the Philippines, China, Kenya, Thailand, South Africa. Lots of issues in South Africa, but actually most people saying that across the world that they live in a cohesive neighbourhood. And we should sometimes remember that. And again, in many countries, and indeed in most countries, you will find that the population is actually less divided than it thinks it is, but probably happier than it thinks it is, and also fatter. So, we are sometimes wrong in our perceptions, as our long-running Perils of Perception series has shown us. But actually, most people feel they live in a cohesive neighbourhood. What we don't necessarily agree on is whether we're fair to people from different backgrounds and ethnic minorities. And again, you can see lots of developing countries saying we are, but then particularly Latin America, really absolutely disagreeing that that is the case. And of course, one of the things about, if you look across the world, while the Western media tends to focus on Western countries, actually the place, the continent with the greatest upheaval, the greatest amount of populism is actually Latin America at the moment. And that's where there is real upheaval and whole generations of people who feel their future has been snatched away from them. And so that is where actually people are least likely to say that they're being treated fairly. But overall, we have a paradox that we face. Globalisation is still fundamental to how we consume, despite all of the disruption from the pandemic. And actually what we can see is that people haven't gone off globalisation with the pandemic. The proportion of people saying that globalisation is good for their country hasn't collapsed. It's gone on rising, despite the fact that sometimes individual people have lost out or feel that they've lost out to jobs that have moved abroad. You can see, of course, China, which is rapidly becoming the world's largest economy, absolutely agreeing that it's wonderful. But Britain, which of course has voted to try and reject globalisation in one way through voting for Brexit, it's still got a majority of people saying that globalisation is good for us. America, despite electing President Trump, who's into trade, was into trade wars and everything else, 50% of people saying that globalisation is good for them. And even the French, who are not very keen on globalisation in any form, have gone up from a quarter to over 3 in 10 now saying that it's actually good for France. So what we're seeing is a really marked preference and a rising preference for local or national brands over global brands. There are still some markets where the majority of people will say international brands are better. Developing places like Nigeria, Kenya, India, Thailand. But for many countries, including China, actually local brands are not seen as inferior to global brands. And there's actual active disagreement that global brands were better. So if you're a foreign business wanting to do business in China, if you're a foreign business wanting to go into Mexico, you need to think about how you're going to localize and how you're going to represent yourself in those markets. Some of this, of course, is a reaction against the stretched supply chains that we saw during the pandemic and the rise of sort of home territory favoritism that we also saw and patriotism that we also saw rise in the pandemic. But it, particularly in the case of enormous markets like China, has real challenges perhaps for some international brands. So overall, 1.5 years into the pandemic, I think actually, if we're honest, there is still more continuity than change. Do not buy the Kool-Aid when somebody tells you the world has fundamentally changed and will never be the same. It's certainly going through upheaval. There are changes in particular spots, but overall, our overall human values actually, when we look across the piece, have not changed anywhere near as much as the media might sometimes have you think. At the same time, we can see, so climate change has gone on rising. We can see this demand for brands to stand up for something to reflect their purchasers' values. Those have just kept on going. That's really just continuity, data apathy in some ways. But at the same time, the key challenge, this loss of the future, it was there before the pandemic, and it remains there now. Those people who were hoping to have a better job for their children to be able to own a home, and now that seems to, even before the pandemic, that was snatched away, and the unequal impacts of the pandemic, if anything, make that worse. That means we face fractious populations. We can see globally that populism is rowing back a bit, but overall, one of the biggest shifts in my work in the 35 years I've been doing this job is the loss of the future in the West. It was there before the pandemic, it's there afterwards, but if you couple that with aging and the changes that we need to make as societies to deal with climate change, which someone is going to have to pay for, which often may mean you won't fly as much as you used to, you won't drive as much as you used to, those are going to be difficult messages for people in charge. There is change, of course, that we can see driven by the pandemic. Certainly attitudes to data, the online and offline world almost blurring together. I think the person who talks about digital as separate from offline has just lost the plot. And this rebalancing that we're seeing with China in some way closed off between the global and local, reshoring, which is the obvious consequence in some cases of those stretched global supply chains, people just reflecting on how their country is going to work with others. That suggests we need real leadership from our politicians as we go forward. And overall then we have these, whether or not we see it in people's values, the world is changing fast. We're moving from, this sort of traditional bipolar world to probably some sort of multipolar world. We're moving from perhaps just being worried about climate change to in the 2020s actually having some action on climate change. We're moving from clear online and offline worlds to blended reality, and if you're retailing and selling things, it certainly is about that blend of physical and online retail. And then our political leaders often found wanting and suddenly being replaced in countries where the political system allows it by outsiders, often with no practical experience of government at all, because the existing political elite has just seen as failing. So some huge challenges. I think the question for 2022 and beyond in one way is, how will those slow-moving values that we know that we have that really aren't moving that fast clash with our changed world? We will keep measuring those in the Global Trends series. And the other thing I think we face is really how will governments and brands, because they're the people expected to do the heavy lifting, how will brands and government lead the public to help them adapt? And on our biggest challenge, which is the one thing the world agrees on, climate change, that's where we need leadership. Thank you very much for listening. Hope that was interesting, and there's lots more where that comes from.